The last ordinary morning began with coffee and promises. Joseph McStay kissed Summer goodbye, their two boys giggling over breakfast bowls in their Fallbrook home. By sunset, 4 lives had vanished into silence that would stretch across years. Their house stood frozen eggs still on the counter, popcorn scattered on the couch, 2 hungry dogs whimpering in the yard. When grainy border footage showed figures resembling the family crossing into Mexico, the world exhaled. Voluntary disappearance seemed logical. The investigation shifted south, chasing ghosts across Tijuana, while truth lay buried in California desert sand. 3 years later, off-road riders would uncover bones and a sledgehammer. DNA would whisper names. Phone records would reveal the last call, the final betrayal. Charles Chase, Merritt, friend, business partner, trusted confidant, would face 4 murder charges that shattered everything anyone thought they knew about loyalty, greed, and the faces evil wears. What turns friendship into a weapon sharp enough to destroy an entire family? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The February morning air carried the scent of orange blossoms through Fallbrook's quiet streets. Inside the McStay home, domestic rhythm played out in familiar beats, Summer spreading peanut butter on toast, while 4-year-old Gianni and 3-year-old Joseph Jr. chased each other around the kitchen island. Joseph adjusted his tie, reviewing notes for his lunch meeting with Chase Merritt. Earth-inspired products had been thriving, their custom water features drawing clients across Southern California. Chase, his business partner and welder, had become more than a colleague. He was family dinners, weekend barbecues, trusted counsel. Don't forget to pick up milk, Summer called, wiping syrup from Joseph Jr.'s cheek. Joseph kissed her forehead, tousled his son's hair, and stepped into sunshine that would be the last they'd share. The Panda Express in Rancho Cucamonga buzzed with lunch crowd conversation. Joseph and Chase ordered their usual, settling into a corner booth. Chase seemed agitated, drumming fingers against the table while Joseph sketched fountain designs on napkins. "Money's tight," Chase muttered, avoiding eye contact. The casino thing got out of hand again. Joseph's pen stopped moving. They'd discussed Chase's gambling before gentle warnings wrapped in friendship. "You need help, brother. Real help." Chase forced a smile. "Just need time. Maybe advance some payment on the next project? Let's finish what we started first." Joseph's tone remained steady, but something shifted in his expression. Trust, once absolute, now carried hairline fractures. They parted ways at 2:47 p.m. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper pulled from the parking lot as Chase watched from his truck. The last witness would remember Joseph checking his phone, smiling at something, probably a text from Summer. By evening, that smile had become a memory. Summer tried calling at 5:30. Voicemail. The boys asked when Daddy was coming home. Bedtime stories went unread. The house settled into a natural quiet, broken only by scratching dogs at the back door. Chase Merritt's phone went dark for 2 hours that night. When questioned later, he'd claim he was driving, sleeping, anywhere but the truth. Security cameras at nearby businesses caught nothing. The suburban streets kept their secrets. Michael McStay's worry began as an itch he couldn't scratch. 5 days without contact wasn't like his brother. Joseph returned calls, texted back, maintained connection. The silence felt wrong. He drove from his home in Escondido to Fallbrook, rehearsing casual excuses for dropping by unannounced. The McStay house sat undisturbed, morning newspapers yellowing on the driveway. Michael knocked, peered through windows, called Joseph's name into emptiness. The spare key remained in its hidden spot. The front door opened onto a life, interrupted mid-motion. Eggs sat on the kitchen counter, whites congealed around broken shells. Bowls of stale popcorn dotted the living room. Summer's purse lay open on the dining table, wallet intact. Upstairs, beds remained unmade. The boys' room held scattered toys, picture books open to half-read stories. In the backyard, 2 dogs whimpered near empty water bowls, ribs showing through matted fur. Michael's hands shook as he dialed 911. "Something's wrong. My brother's family, they're just gone." The responding officer found no signs of forced entry, no blood, no struggle. Personal items remained untouched. Summer's jewelry, Joseph's laptop, cash in the kitchen drawer. If they'd left voluntarily, they'd taken nothing. The Fallbrook Sheriff's Department opened a missing persons case. Detective units canvassed neighbors, who recalled nothing unusual. Thursday, February 4th had passed like any other kids playing, dogs barking, suburban life humming its peaceful tune. Local news picked up the story by weekend. The McStay family's wholesome photos appeared on television screens across San Diego County. 4 beautiful faces, frozen in happier moments, stared back at a community, suddenly aware that safety was always more fragile than it seemed. Tips flooded the hotline. A woman claimed she'd seen Summer at a Walmart in Escondido. A man reported the family boarding a bus in Oceanside. None led anywhere. The trail remained cold, scattered like breadcrumbs in wind. Michael established himself as the family's voice, giving interviews, posting flyers, maintaining pressure on investigators. His steady persistence masked growing dread. In quiet moments, he caught himself listening for Joseph's laugh, Summer's voice calling the boys to dinner. The house began to feel like a museum, preserved, untouchable, waiting for occupants who might never return. The white Isuzu Trooper surfaced 4 days later in a parking lot near the San Ysidro border crossing. Abandoned, keys missing, it sat among dozens of vehicles left by people crossing into Mexico. Border Patrol reviewed surveillance footage from February 4th. At 7:47 p.m., cameras captured a family of 4 walking toward Tijuana. Adult male, adult female, 2 small children. The image quality was poor, faces indistinct, but body types and clothing matched witness descriptions of the McStays. The revelation transformed the investigation overnight. Voluntary disappearance suddenly seemed plausible. Perhaps the family had debts, enemies, reasons to flee. Mexico offered anonymity, a chance to start over beyond American law enforcement's reach. Detective units redirected their focus south of the border. Tijuana police searched hotels, questioned contacts, followed leads that evaporated in the city's sprawling chaos. American authorities had limited jurisdiction. Mexican cooperation came slowly, and the trail grew colder with each passing day. Media coverage shifted tone. Headlines changed from family vanishes to family flees. Neighbors whispered about financial troubles, hidden problems, secrets behind the suburban facade. The McStays transformed from victims to people with something to hide. Michael fought the narrative publicly, insisting his brother would never abandon his business, his responsibilities, his life. Joseph didn't run from problems, he told reporters. He faced them, but doubt crept into even his certainty. Had he missed signs, known his brother as well as he'd thought? The Mexico theory offered answers to questions that otherwise had none. Customs records showed no official entry under the McStay names, but crossing without documentation was common. Underground networks move families daily. If the McStays wanted to disappear, Mexico provided the perfect void. Chase Merritt appeared on television describing his last lunch with Joseph. He seemed stressed, Chase told a reporter. Business pressures, you know, but he never mentioned leaving his business. Concern appeared genuine, his confusion authentic. Friends rallied to support him, knowing how close he'd been to the family. The idea that Joseph might have fled without warning seemed to wound Chase personally. Investigators noted his cooperation, his willingness to answer questions, his emotional investment in finding his missing friends. If the family had been murdered, Chase would have been an obvious suspect. But with Mexico looming as explanation, other theories faded. Television talk shows seized the McStay story with hungry fascination. Nancy Grace theorized about witness protection programs. Dr. Phil explored family breakdown under financial stress. Online forums buzzed with speculation, cult recruitment, drug cartel involvement, government conspiracy. Chase Merritt became a frequent guest, his folksy charm and apparent grief playing well for cameras. Joseph was my best friend, he told host after host. If he's out there, if he's watching, buddy, just let us know you're okay. Behind the scenes, inconsistencies began emerging. Bank records showed unusual activity in Joseph's business accounts after February 4th. Checks bore signatures that looked like Joseph's but felt wrong to those who knew his handwriting. Earth-inspired products continued operating despite its owner's absence. Chase explained the transactions as completing existing contracts, honoring Joseph's commitments. The forged signatures were dismissed as nervous penmanship under stress, reasonable explanations for unreasonable circumstances. A private polygraph test, quietly administered, showed deception indicators when Chase was asked about his whereabouts on February 4th. But polygraphs weren't admissible in court, and without a crime scene, prosecutors had no case to build. The investigation stalled in bureaucratic limbo. Too little evidence for charges. Too many questions for closure. Detectives moved on to fresher cases. The McStay file grew dusty in storage. Social media kept the story alive through amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists. Websites analyzed the border footage frame by frame, debating whether the figures were actually the McStays. Comment sections became battlegrounds between those who believed in voluntary disappearance and those who sensed something darker. Michael never stopped pushing. He hired private investigators, offered rewards, maintained a website dedicated to finding his brother's family. His persistence bordered on obsession. Friends worried about his health, but he couldn't let go. Summer's mother appeared on talk shows, pleading for her daughter's return. The boys' grandparents aged visibly, hope and despair warring in their faces. Family gatherings became exercises in avoiding the empty chairs, the unspoken names. Years passed, the story faded from headlines, relegated to cold case files and internet forums. America's attention moved on to newer mysteries, fresher tragedies. The McStay family became footnotes in missing persons databases. Only those who'd loved them refused to forget. November 11, 2013, dawned clear and cold in the Mojave Desert. Off-road motorcycle riders explored trails near Victorville, engines echoing across empty landscape. They'd chosen the remote area for its solitude, its freedom from civilization's intrusions. One rider noticed something unusual: disturbed earth, unnatural depressions in the sandy soil. Closer inspection revealed what looked like crude graves, shallow excavations in the desert floor. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department responded to the call within hours. Crime scene investigators cordoned off the area, beginning the delicate process of excavation. What they found would shatter the Mexico theory forever. 2 grave sites yielded skeletal remains of 4 individuals, 2 adults, 2 children. The bones showed signs of violent trauma, blunt force injuries consistent with a heavy weapon. Scattered among the remains were fragments of clothing, personal effects, and a rusted sledgehammer. Dental records confirmed the unthinkable truth. Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. McStay had never crossed into Mexico. They'd been murdered and buried in the California desert, less than 200 miles from their Fallbrook home. The discovery exploded across news networks. 3 years of investigation had followed a false trail while the family lay dead in unmarked graves. The border footage, analyzed more carefully, showed strangers with superficial resemblances to the McStays, a coincidence that had misdirected an entire investigation. Michael received the call at his office. "We found them," the detective said simply. No words could cushion such news. Relief at having answers mixed with horror at what those answers revealed. His brother's family hadn't fled, they'd been slaughtered. Media descended on Victorville. The desert crime scene became a pilgrimage site for those who'd followed the case. Flowers appeared along police tape, teddy bears for the children, candles that flickered in the desert wind. The sheriff's department faced uncomfortable questions. How had they missed the truth for so long? Why had the Mexico theory dominated investigation when evidence pointed elsewhere? Careers hung in the balance as officials scrambled to rebuild public confidence. But the focus quickly shifted from past mistakes to present pursuit. The McStays had been murdered. Someone was responsible. The hunt for their killer was about to begin. The crime scene yielded crucial evidence despite 3 years of weathering. Forensic pathologists determined that all 4 victims had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The weapon, a 3-pound sledgehammer found near the bodies, bore traces of blood and hair. Burial patterns suggested the killings had happened elsewhere. The bodies had been transported to the desert and hastily interred in shallow graves. Lack of decomposition evidence at other locations indicated the family had been murdered and moved the same night. Detective units reopened every aspect of the original investigation. Phone records, financial documents, witness statements, everything was re-examined through the lens of homicide rather than missing persons. Chase Merritt's timeline came under intense scrutiny. Cell tower data placed his phone near the McStay home on the evening of February 4th, contradicting his claims of being elsewhere. A 2-hour gap in his phone activity aligned perfectly with the estimated time of death. Bank records revealed a pattern of forged checks drawn on Joseph's business accounts. Handwriting analysis suggested Chase as the author, though he maintained the signatures were legitimate. Nearly $21,000 had been withdrawn in the weeks following the murders. DNA evidence provided the strongest link. Crime lab technicians found Chase's genetic material on the Isuzu Trooper's gearshift, not enough for definitive proof, but sufficient to place him in the vehicle after the family's disappearance. The motive crystallized around money and desperation. Chase's gambling debts had mounted into the tens of thousands. His partnership with Joseph was under strain as the business struggled. Financial records showed Joseph had been preparing to dissolve their arrangement. Friends and family began recalling warning signs they'd missed. Summer had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around Chase in recent months. Joseph had questioned business expenses, noticed discrepancies in accounts. The trust that had bound their partnership was already fraying. Detectives built their case methodically, assembling evidence that would support murder charges. After 3 years of frustration and false leads, they finally had a target. The investigation had found its focus. Community vigils in Fallbrook drew hundreds of mourners, The story had transformed from mysterious disappearance to brutal betrayal. Neighbors who'd known the McStays personally struggled to comprehend such violence visited upon innocents. Chase Merritt, unaware of the closing net, continued his media appearances. His expressions of grief for his missing friends now carried different weight. Viewers who'd once sympathized with his loss began questioning his sincerity. November 5, 2014, marked exactly 4 years and 9 months since the McStay family's disappearance. On that morning, a SWAT team surrounded Chase Merritt's vehicle in a Los Angeles County parking lot. He emerged calmly, hands raised, showing no surprise at his arrest. "This is about the McStays, isn't it?" he asked officers. His tone carried resignation rather than shock, as if he'd been expecting this moment. The arrest warrant charged him with 4 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. Media crews captured his booking photos. A man who'd spent years in the spotlight as concerned friend, now identified as suspected killer. Chase's first court appearance drew packed crowds. Family members sat in the front row. Michael McStay's face, a mask of controlled fury. After 4 years of uncertainty, they finally faced the man they believed had destroyed their loved ones. The defendant appeared subdued, conferring quietly with his appointed attorney. He entered not guilty pleas to all charges, maintaining the innocence he'd proclaimed for years. But the evidence against him had grown overwhelming. Prosecutors outlined their case in preliminary hearings. Phone records, financial documents, DNA evidence, and motive combined to paint a picture of premeditated murder for financial gain. The theory was simple. Chase had killed his business partner's family to cover up theft and eliminate witnesses. Defense attorneys argued the evidence was circumstantial, that Chase's presence in the McStay vehicle could be explained by their business relationship. They pointed to the 3-year gap between murders and arrest, suggesting evidence could have been contaminated or misinterpreted. But public opinion had shifted decisively. The man who'd appeared on television as grieving friend was now seen as calculating murderer. His expressions of concern were reframed as performance, his cooperation with investigators as manipulation. Chase requested to represent himself at trial, firing his court-appointed attorneys. The judge warned him of the dangers but granted his request. His decision surprised legal observers. Death penalty cases demanded expertise he didn't possess. Trial was scheduled for the following year. The McStay family's long journey toward justice was entering its final phase. After years of questions, answers were within reach. The Fallbrook community braced for revelations that would reshape their understanding of trust, friendship, and the darkness that could hide behind familiar faces. Trial preparation consumed months as prosecutors assembled their evidence into a coherent narrative. The case hinged on circumstantial proof. No witnesses had seen the murders, no confession existed, but the accumulated facts pointed inexorably toward Chase Merritt's guilt. Lead prosecutor focused on 3 pillars: means, motive, and opportunity. Chase had access to the McStay home, knowledge of their routines, and physical capability to commit the crimes. Financial desperation provided motive. His presence near their house on February 4th established opportunity. The defense strategy centered on reasonable doubt. Without direct evidence, prosecutors relied on inference and circumstance. Chase's attorneys, he'd hired new counsel after briefly representing himself, would argue that suspicion wasn't proof, that alternative explanations existed for every piece of evidence. Jury selection revealed deep community investment in the case. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the McStay family, their opinions on the investigation, their ability to consider evidence objectively, despite years of media coverage. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from their 20s to 60s. All claimed they could set aside preconceptions and judge the case on evidence presented in court. Opening statements were scheduled for January. The courtroom would become a theater where 4 years of investigation culminated in adversarial truth-seeking. Families on both sides prepared for testimony that would determine whether Chase Merritt lived or died. Media coverage intensified as trial approached. Court TV announced plans for daily broadcasts. Local news stations assigned full-time reporters to the case. The McStay murders had become California's most watched criminal proceeding in years. Michael McStay gave final interviews before entering the courtroom. "We've waited so long for this," he told reporters. "Joseph, Summer, the boys, they deserve justice. We deserve answers." For Chase Merritt, the trial represented his last chance to maintain innocence. In private jail conversations recorded by authorities, he'd continued proclaiming his innocence, claiming he was being framed by corrupt investigators. The stage was set for a legal confrontation that would determine whether friendship and trust could survive their ultimate betrayal. January opening statements drew a packed courtroom, judge seated at his bench, jury in their box, families filling the gallery, all focused on the two attorneys who would shape their understanding of the evidence. The prosecutor spoke first, his voice calm but firm. This case is about greed masquerading as friendship. The defendant, Chase Merritt, murdered Joseph McStay and his family for money. The evidence will show a pattern of theft, deception, and ultimately violence when his crimes threatened exposure. He outlined the timeline: lunch on February 4th, the family's disappearance that evening, Chase's phone going dark during the crucial hours, bank records showing forged checks, DNA evidence placing him in the family vehicle, the sledgehammer found with the bodies, bearing tool marks consistent with his workshop equipment. The defendant appeared on television for years, expressing concern for his missing friends. But he knew where they were because he put them there, in the Mojave Desert, buried in shallow graves, while he stole from their accounts and lied to their loved ones. The defense response acknowledged the case's emotional weight while attacking the prosecution's theory. Chase Merritt loved the McStay family. He's devastated by their deaths, but grief isn't guilt and suspicion isn't proof. The prosecution asks you to convict based on inference and assumption, not facts. They emphasize the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Chase's presence near the McStay home could be explained by their business relationship. The DNA in the vehicle was consistent with someone who'd ridden in it. Legitimate. The financial irregularities might have alternative explanations. Don't let emotion override reason. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They cannot do so because Chase Merritt is innocent. The battle lines were drawn. Over the coming weeks, witnesses would testify to bank fraud, phone records, DNA analysis, and forensic pathology. The jury would hear from family members, investigators, and experts as both sides fought to control the narrative. Chase sat at the defense table, taking notes, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. His demeanor appeared calm, focused, alert. The man who'd charmed television audiences now faced the most important performance of his life. Michael McStay watched from the gallery, his eyes never leaving the defendant. 4 years of waiting had led to this moment. Justice delayed but not denied. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over several weeks. Forensic accountants testified about forged signatures on business checks. Handwriting experts compared known samples of Joseph's penmanship with the disputed documents, finding significant variations suggesting fraud. Cell phone records dominated technical testimony. Prosecution witnesses explained how tower pings could establish location and movement. Chase's phone had gone silent for exactly 2 hours on February 4th, the window when the murders likely occurred. DNA analysts took the stand to explain the genetic evidence found in the McStay vehicle. While the sample was small, it matched Chase's profile with statistical certainty. The defense argued the DNA could have been deposited during legitimate business interactions. Most damaging was testimony about the sledgehammer found with the bodies. Tool mark analysis showed microscopic similarities between the weapon and equipment from Chase's welding shop. While not definitive, the comparison suggested a connection. Family members provided emotional testimony about the victims' characters and relationships. Joseph's mother described her son's growing concerns about his business partnership. Summer's friend recalled conversations about feeling uncomfortable around Chase in the months before the murders. Michael McStay's testimony proved particularly powerful. He described discovering the empty house, the years of uncertainty, the moment he learned the family had been murdered. His composure broke only when showing photographs of his nephews. Joseph trusted Chase completely, Michael told the jury. He brought him into our family. Chase ate at our tables, played with the boys, was part of our lives. That trust cost them everything. The defense cross-examination focused on alternative theories and reasonable doubt. They suggested other business associates might have had access to accounts. They questioned the reliability of DNA evidence after 3 years in the desert. They emphasized that no witness had seen Chase commit any crime. Media coverage intensified as prosecution testimony concluded. Legal analysts debated the strength of the circumstantial case. Public opinion polls showed majority belief in Chase's guilt, but questions remained about whether evidence would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The defense would soon present their case, likely featuring Chase's own testimony. His decision to take the stand carried enormous risk. Prosecutors would have the opportunity to cross-examine him about every aspect of his story. The defense opened by calling character witnesses who testified to Chase's good reputation in the community. Former clients praised his work ethic and honesty. Neighbors described him as helpful and reliable. The strategy aimed to humanize a defendant portrayed by prosecutors as coldly calculating. Technical experts challenged the prosecution's evidence. A DNA specialist questioned contamination possibilities after years in the desert environment. A handwriting analyst disputed earlier testimony, suggesting the questioned signatures could be legitimate variations of Joseph's penmanship. Defense attorneys presented alternative theories for the family's disappearance and murder. They suggested drug cartels might have targeted the McStays for unknown reasons. They questioned whether the border footage might have actually shown the family fleeing unknown threats. But the defense case's centerpiece was Chase Merritt himself. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on testifying. The courtroom packed as spectators waited to hear from the man at the center of the conspiracy. Chase's direct examination lasted 2 days. He denied every accusation with apparent sincerity. Yes, he'd forged checks, but with Joseph's permission for ongoing business expenses. Yes, his phone went dark, but he'd been sleeping after drinking too much at home. Yes, his DNA was in the vehicle, but he'd ridden with Joseph countless times. I loved that family, he told the jury, voice breaking with emotion. Joseph was my best friend. Summer was like a sister. Those boys called me Uncle Chase. I would never hurt them, never. He acknowledged financial problems but denied desperation. The gambling debts were manageable, the business partnership was stable, the future was promising. He had no motive for murder because his life was improving, not deteriorating. Cross-examination proved devastating. The prosecutor methodically dismantled Chase's explanations, revealing contradictions and inconsistencies. Phone records didn't support his claimed whereabouts. Bank statements showed mounting debts he'd minimized. Witness testimony contradicted his version of events. Most damaging was his explanation for appearing on television after the family's disappearance. If he'd killed them, why risk public exposure? Chase claimed he genuinely believed they might be alive, that Mexico remained possible. You appeared on shows for 4 years, the prosecutor observed, knowing those people were dead in the desert because you put them there. That's not true, Chase replied, but his composure was cracking. Closing arguments synthesized weeks of testimony into competing narratives. The prosecution painted Chase as a desperate man who chose murder over financial ruin. When Joseph discovered the forged checks and threatened to end their partnership, Chase killed the family to eliminate witnesses and buy time. The defendant sat in television studios, looked into cameras, and lied to America about missing friends he knew were dead. He attended vigils, comforted family members, helped search for people he'd murdered. This level of deception reveals a man capable of any evil. The prosecutor walked the jury through the evidence systematically: financial motive, opportunity, physical evidence, and consciousness of guilt demonstrated through years of lies. Each piece alone might create doubt. Together, they prove guilt beyond any reasonable question. The defense closing emphasized reasonable doubt and alternative explanations. Every piece of evidence had innocent interpretations. The prosecution had failed to prove premeditation, failed to establish definitive motive, failed to connect Chase directly to the crime scene. Convicting my client requires you to make assumptions, draw inferences, and accept possibilities as facts. The law demands more. Proof beyond reasonable doubt means exactly that. If doubt exists, if alternatives are possible, you must find him not guilty. They reminded jurors of Chase's consistent denials, his cooperation with investigators, his emotional testimony. This is not the behavior of a guilty man. This is someone devastated by loss, confused by accusations, destroyed by suspicion. The prosecution's rebuttal was brief but forceful. The defense asks you to ignore evidence and embrace doubt. But evidence doesn't lie. DNA doesn't lie. Phone records don't lie. Financial documents don't lie. Only people lie, and the defendant has been lying for years. Jury deliberations began on a Friday afternoon. The panel would spend the weekend reviewing evidence, debating testimony, searching their consciences for the truth. Outside the courthouse, media maintained vigil. Michael McStay and other family members waited in painful suspense. Chase returned to his jail cell, having done everything possible to avoid conviction. His fate now rested with 12 strangers who'd heard conflicting versions of reality and must decide which to believe. The long journey toward justice was entering its final hours. Monday morning brought word that the jury had reached a verdict after deliberating for nearly 3 days. The courtroom filled quickly as news spread through social media and television alerts. Family members, reporters, and curious observers packed every available seat. Chase entered looking haggard, weekend stress evident in his posture and expression. His attorneys flanked him at the defense table while prosecutors sat confidently nearby. The judge called for order as tension filled the air. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial, stood with papers in hand. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Joseph McStay, how do you find?" "Guilty," gasps echoed through the courtroom. Michael McStay closed his eyes, 4 years of pain finding its first moment of relief. "On the charge of murder in the first degree of Summer McStay, how do you find?" "Guilty." The foreperson continued through each count: guilty of murdering Gianni, guilty of murdering Joseph Jr., guilty of the special circumstances that made Chase eligible for the death penalty. 4 lives, 4 guilty verdicts. Justice finally speaking after years of silence. Chase showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his lawyers patting his shoulders in futile comfort. In the gallery, family members wept tears of relief, mixed with grief that no verdict could heal. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing hearings for the following month. The penalty phase would determine whether Chase received life imprisonment or death. California's ultimate punishment awaited the jury's final decision. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors addressed media crowds. "Justice has been served for the McStay family," the lead attorney announced. 4 innocent lives were taken by someone they trusted. Today's verdict acknowledges that betrayal and honors their memory. Defense attorneys promised appeals, claiming procedural errors and insufficient evidence, but their words carried hollow echo after the jury's decisive judgment. Chase Merritt had been unanimously convicted of quadruple murder. Michael McStay spoke briefly to reporters. "This doesn't bring them back," he said quietly. "But Joseph, Summer, and the boys can rest, knowing their killer will answer for what he did." The community exhaled collectively. A question that had haunted them for nearly 5 years finally had an answer. The penalty phase began 3 weeks later with victim impact statements that brought the courtroom to tears. Joseph's mother spoke first, her voice barely audible as she described the grandchildren she'd never see grow up. Gianni would be 9 now, Joseph Jr. would be 8. "I imagine them playing soccer, learning to read, laughing at family dinners. Instead, I visit graves in the desert. Chase Merritt stole our future, our happiness, our family." Summer's father followed, reading a letter he'd written to his murdered daughter. "You were sunshine in human form, baby girl. You made everyone around you better. Your boys were lucky to have you as their mother, even for the short time they had." Michael's testimony proved most devastating. He'd prepared remarks but abandoned them, speaking instead from his heart about the brother he'd lost. "Joseph was my best friend, my role model, my anchor. He worked hard, loved deeply, trusted completely. That trust killed him." The prosecution argued for death, citing the murder's brutality and the victim's innocence. The defendant executed an entire family, 2 helpless children and their loving parents. He showed no mercy, felt no remorse, told lies for years. Justice demands the ultimate penalty. Defense attorneys pleaded for life imprisonment, arguing that Chase's cooperation during the investigation showed humanity beneath the crime. They presented evidence of his troubled childhood, his struggles with addiction, his capacity for good in other relationships. Chase himself addressed the jury one final time. "I know you've found me guilty, but I maintain my innocence. I love that family. If somehow I caused their deaths, I'm sorry, but I didn't kill them. I couldn't kill them." His words rang hollow after weeks of evidence. The jury retired to consider whether Chase Merritt would live or die for his crimes. Deliberations lasted 2 days. When they returned, the foreperson delivered the sentence with steady voice. "We, the jury, fix the penalty at death." The judge formally imposed the death sentence, ordering Chase to be executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. Appeals would delay the sentence for years, possibly decades, but the state's intention was clear. Family members embraced outside the courthouse. After 5 years of uncertainty and pain, justice had been served completely. The McStay murders case was officially closed. In the months following the verdict, Fallbrook began healing from wounds that had festered for half a decade. The McStay home, long abandoned, was finally sold to a family who promised to fill it with laughter again. Neighbors slowly stopped checking locks twice and watching strangers with suspicion. Michael McStay established a foundation in his brother's memory, focusing on helping other families navigate missing persons cases. The organization provided resources, emotional support, and advocacy for improved investigation procedures. Joseph always helped people, Michael explained at the foundation's launch. This is how we keep his spirit alive, by helping others find answers when their loved ones disappear. The detective who'd worked the case from beginning to end announced his retirement, citing emotional exhaustion from years of pursuing false leads and watching family members suffer. In his final interview, he acknowledged mistakes but expressed satisfaction with the ultimate outcome. "We got justice for that family," he reflected. "It took too long, cost too much pain, but we got there. Sometimes that's all you can ask for." Chase Merritt sat on death row, filing appeals that would wind through courts for years. His conviction had been upheld on initial review, but capital cases generated automatic appeals that could last decades. He maintained his innocence in jailhouse interviews, claiming he'd been framed by corrupt investigators. True crime shows dissected the case endlessly, analyzing the investigation's early missteps and the evidence that finally brought conviction. The McStay murders became a cautionary tale about trusting too easily and missing obvious signs of danger. Forensic experts used the case in training seminars, highlighting how digital evidence, phone records, bank transactions, DNA analysis had ultimately solved crimes that seemed impossible to crack. Technology had given voice to victims who couldn't speak for themselves. The Mojave Desert site where the bodies were found became an unofficial memorial. Visitors left flowers, toys for the children, notes expressing sympathy and anger. A small wooden cross marked the spot where innocence had been buried and truth had finally been unearthed. Summer's artwork, discovered in storage, was displayed at a community center exhibit honoring her memory. Her paintings revealed a gentle soul who found beauty in everyday moments, sunsets over their Fallbrook home, her boys playing in the backyard, quiet domestic scenes that now carried heartbreaking poignancy. The exhibit drew hundreds of visitors who hadn't known Summer personally but felt connected to her story. Children left drawings for Gianni and Joseph Jr. Adults signed a memory book with messages of sympathy and support for the surviving family. Local schools implemented new safety programs, teaching children about trusting their instincts and recognizing warning signs. The McStay case had shown how danger could hide behind familiar faces, how evil could masquerade as friendship. Chase's former clients struggled with the revelation that they'd welcomed a killer into their homes. Several sought counseling to process feelings of betrayal and violation. The welding community in San Diego County was forever changed by association with his crimes. Earth-inspired products was dissolved, its assets distributed to pay outstanding debts and provide modest support for the victim's extended family. Joseph's creative designs, sketched on napkins and brought to life in stone and water, became his lasting professional legacy. Years passed slowly for those closest to the case. Michael aged visibly, his face carrying lines carved by grief and responsibility. He'd become the family's historian, keeper of memories, guardian of their story against those who would exploit or sensationalize their tragedy. At annual memorial services, he spoke about healing without forgetting, moving forward while honoring the past. Joseph, Summer, and the boys didn't die for nothing if we learn from their story. If we become more careful about who we trust, more vigilant about protecting our families. The legal appeals dragged on as expected. Chase's new attorneys raised procedural challenges, questioned evidence handling, claimed ineffective counsel during trial. Each motion was denied, each appeal rejected, but the process continued its grinding pace toward eventual execution. Victims' rights advocates cited the McStay case as justification for streamlined death penalty procedures. The family had waited 5 years for justice, now faced decades more waiting for final resolution. The system's pace felt like additional punishment for those seeking closure. Detective units across California studied the case file, learning how early assumptions had derailed the investigation. Training programs emphasized following evidence rather than theories, questioning convenient explanations, maintaining skepticism about obvious suspects. The Mexico border footage that had misdirected the investigation was preserved as a teaching tool. Academy instructors showed how grainy surveillance could create false certainties, how confirmation bias could blind investigators to other possibilities. Crime scene investigators developed new protocols for desert excavations, improving techniques for preserving evidence in harsh environments. The McStay dig had shown how much information could survive years of exposure if handled properly. Media coverage evolved from sensational speculation to thoughtful analysis. Responsible journalists examined how their early reporting had amplified false theories, contributing to investigation delays. Professional standards were raised for covering missing persons cases. The community memorial for the McStay family was dedicated on the 5th anniversary of their discovery. Local officials, law enforcement, and hundreds of residents gathered in Fallbrook's Central Park to honor 4 lives cut short by greed and betrayal. A bronze plaque bore their names and faces: Joseph's strong jaw, Summer's gentle smile, the boys' bright eyes full of promise. Beneath their images, simple words: beloved family, taken too soon, never forgotten. Michael spoke to the crowd about forgiveness and healing. Hatred corrodes the soul, he said. We choose to remember love instead of violence, joy instead of sorrow, hope instead of despair. That's how we honor their memory. The ceremony concluded with the release of white balloons, each carrying written messages to the family. Children drew pictures, adults wrote poems, elderly residents shared memories of the days when Fallbrook felt safer, more innocent. Local high school students performed a song written in the family's honor. The lyrics spoke of light overcoming darkness, love surviving death, truth emerging from lies. Many in the audience wept openly as young voices carried pain toward healing. Chase Merritt's appeals continued their slow journey through federal courts. His case had become a footnote in legal databases, another death row inmate among hundreds awaiting uncertain fate. The media attention had faded. Public interest had moved to newer crimes. In his jail cell, Chase maintained correspondence with a few supporters who believed in his innocence. He wrote letters proclaiming his love for the McStay family, his devastation at their deaths, his confusion about the conviction. Whether these expressions were genuine or calculated, only he knew. The detective who'd solved the case sometimes drove past the memorial plaque during evening walks. He'd retired but couldn't fully escape the weight of those years. The case had defined his career, validated his persistence, but also aged him beyond his years. Joseph's business associates had scattered to other companies, other lives. They carried memories of a man who'd treated employees fairly, customers honestly, partners generously. His professional reputation remained untainted by the violence that had claimed his life. Summer's friends maintained a private social media group where they shared photos and memories. Birthday posts for the boys showed what they might have looked like at 9 and 10. Grief had evolved into celebration of lives briefly lived. The final appeal was denied on a cold December morning, 7 years after the conviction. The Supreme Court's rejection was brief, technical, final. Charles Merritt's legal options were exhausted. The death sentence would stand. Michael received the news by phone from the prosecutor's office. After so many delays, the finality felt surreal. "It's over," he told his wife. "Really over this time." The execution date was set for the following summer, pending final preparations at San Quentin. Victims' rights advocates praised the decision while death penalty opponents prepared protests. The case had become symbolic of justice delayed but not denied. Chase's remaining supporters organized final appeals to the governor for clemency. They argued his case represented circumstantial conviction, questioned the evidence quality, pleaded for life imprisonment instead of death. Their efforts generated minimal public support. Local news covered the story with measured reporting, acknowledging the case's impact on the community while respecting the family's desire for privacy. The sensational phase had passed. What remained was sad inevitability. Michael faced a difficult decision about witnessing the execution. Part of him needed to see justice completed, but another part worried about carrying that final image. He consulted grief counselors, spoke with other families who'd faced similar choices. The Fallbrook community prepared for closure they'd awaited nearly a decade. Some residents planned vigils, others preferred private reflection. The case had marked their town, changed their sense of security, but also shown their capacity for solidarity. Summer's mother, now in her 70s, expressed mixed feelings about the approaching execution. "It won't bring them back," she told a reporter, "but maybe their spirits can rest, knowing he can't hurt anyone else." The memorial plaque in the park had weathered several seasons, bronze patina deepening with age. Visitors still left flowers, especially on anniversaries and holidays. The spot had become sacred ground where community grief found expression. Chase spent his final months in isolation, appeals exhausted, execution approaching. His behavior reports were mixed, sometimes cooperative, occasionally disruptive, always maintaining innocence. Guards noted his declining physical health but persistent mental alertness. On the day of execution, Michael drove alone to San Quentin State Prison. The decision to witness had been agonizing, but he felt Joseph would want family present. Someone who loved them should be there, he'd told his wife. The execution proceeded without incident. Chase's final statement maintained his innocence one last time. "I loved the McStay family," he said to the witnesses. "I'm sorry for their deaths, but I didn't kill them." The words rang hollow after years of evidence and conviction. At 6:18 p.m. Pacific Time, Charles Chase Merritt was pronounced dead. 9 years and 4 months after murdering his business partner's family, justice was finally complete. The case that had captivated California and haunted a community reached its legal conclusion. Michael felt no satisfaction, only empty completion. "It's finished," he called his mother from the prison parking lot. "Chase is gone. They can rest now." News of the execution dominated evening broadcasts and social media. Comments ranged from celebration to condemnation, reflecting America's divided opinions on capital punishment. The McStay case had become larger than its facts, symbolizing debates about justice, mercy, and societal revenge. The Fallbrook community marked the moment with quiet reflection rather than celebration. At the memorial plaque, residents left fresh flowers and lit candles as darkness fell. Their vigil honored victims rather than celebrating their killer's death. True crime shows prepared retrospective episodes, examining the case from investigation to execution. The story had all elements of compelling drama: family annihilation, friends' betrayal, investigative mistakes, eventual justice. But behind the narrative were real people whose lives had been destroyed. Michael returned home to find yellow ribbons tied to neighborhood trees, a silent show of support from friends and neighbors. The gesture moved him to tears, not for Chase's death, but for the community's enduring compassion after nearly a decade of shared grief. In the days following the execution, media attention gradually faded. The case was closed, justice served, story concluded. America's short attention span moved to newer tragedies, fresher outrages, different victims demanding remembrance. The desert wind still blows across the Mojave, carrying sand over the spot where the McStay family was found. The graves have been filled, the site unmarked except by GPS coordinates in police files. Time erases physical evidence, but memory preserves what matters. Justice spoke its final word when Chase Merritt died by lethal injection, but healing remains personal, ongoing, incomplete. The family he destroyed cannot be restored. The trust he shattered cannot be repaired. Some wounds never fully close. Yet in Fallbrook, children play safely in yards where parents watch more carefully. Neighbors check on each other with renewed vigilance. The community learned that evil can wear familiar faces, but also that persistence and science can still uncover truth. Michael keeps his brother's memory alive through foundation work and quiet advocacy. He speaks at conferences about family advocacy, missing persons cases, and the long road to justice. His hair has grayed, his face has aged, but his voice remains steady. "They were just a normal family," he tells audiences. Joseph working, Summer caring for the boys, building dreams like any of us. Evil found them anyway, but good people fought for them, and truth finally won. The case files sit in storage now, evidence preserved for history and training. Future detectives will study the investigation's missteps and breakthroughs, learning how assumptions can mislead and persistence can prevail. The McStay family's tragedy became a lesson in both human darkness and institutional determination. Sometimes visitors still come to the memorial plaque, drawn by true crime podcasts or television documentaries. They leave flowers for strangers, moved by a story that transcends its facts to touch universal fears and hopes. In their quiet tribute, the family lives on. The desert remembers nothing. Wind, sand, and time erase all traces. But in human hearts and institutional memory, 4 innocent lives echo forward, demanding we stay vigilant against the evil that walks among us, wearing the masks of friendship and trust.